On our 10th wedding anniversary, I opened the door, expecting my husband with flowers, but instead, I found him standing over a suitcase, divorce papers in hand, his eyes colder than the night outside. I rushed back from a 12-hour shift that afternoon, hair pinned up hastily, my feet aching from endless rounds through hospital corridors. Still, I set the balcony with care. Fairy lights dangled along the railing, tiny sparks trapped in wire, flickering like captured fireflies. On the table I placed Ethan's favorite craft beers, the kind imported from Oregon with indigo and copper labels. I carried home a custard cake from a French bakery downtown, its glaze so smooth it caught every glimmer of light. I even slipped into the navy wrap dress he once said made my eyes glow warmer, a dress I had not worn in months, hoping it would remind him of the woman he once swore he loved. By 7 o'clock the chicken was roasted. The thyme filled the air, the silverware was polished and gleaming. The table was ready, and so was I. Heart pounding with the same nervous anticipation I'd felt on our very first anniversary dinner. At 8, I lit the candles. At 9, I texted him, "I'm waiting." At 9:30, I called. The phone rang into voicemail, again and again. At 10:07, the silence broke with a ding, not a knock, not a call. Just an email. "Sorry. Meeting with executives. Can't make it? We'll celebrate later." No happy anniversary. No thank you. Not even my name. Just sterile words from a glowing screen, colder than the autumn air that crept between the balcony railings. The chicken cooled into rubber, the custard cake sweated in the fridge, and I sat frozen in the chair, holding a napkin I had folded so carefully, staring at it as if it could explain what had gone wrong. I did not cry. I only felt something inside me shift, like a frame sliding off its nail, hovering before the fall. By midnight, I was still in that navy dress, lying stiff on one side of our bed. The sheets carried faint traces of Ethan's cologne, but the absence of his body was heavier than any scent. I watched the alarm clock numbers crawl. 12:01, 12:37, 1:05. The minutes pressed against my chest like insects crawling beneath my skin. Each tick whispered the truth I refused to admit. He had chosen not to come home. Nurses know when symptoms can't be ignored, and that night I knew what I had been denying for years. My marriage was in cardiac arrest, and I was the only one trying to keep it alive. When dawn came, I tied my hair back, buttoned my scrubs, and went to work as if nothing had happened. At the hospital, coworkers joked about their weekend plans. I smiled faintly, charting vitals, forcing my voice into something steady. But each time I glanced at my phone, the screen was blank. No apology, no explanation, nothing. By noon, the silence became unbearable. I dialed Ethan's office, needing proof that he was still tethered to something familiar. The receptionist paused too long before answering. "Oh, he resigned last week. Didn't he tell you?" "Resigned." The word rang in my head like a siren. "When?" I asked, gripping the receiver. 3 days ago. He didn't leave any forwarding information." My knees weakened. The fluorescent hallway around me spun, buzzing lights overhead like angry bees. My pulse hammered in my ears. Ethan hadn't just missed a dinner, he had walked out of an entire life. Without telling me, that evening I drove home with both hands strangling the steering wheel, headlights blurring into streaks, the highway humming like a dirt. When I unlocked the apartment door, the first thing I saw was the shoe rack, the empty space where his brown leather boots had always sat. My throat tightened. "Ethan," my voice echoed back, unanswered. I moved quickly to the bedroom, and what I found there hollowed me out completely. He was standing by the bed. Suitcase open, shirts and ties spilling like entrails, a navy suit stretched across the mattress, a new pair of dress shoes gleaming, the tags still hanging. Not the signs of a man late from work, the signs of a man leaving. "What are you doing?" My voice cracked into the quiet. Ethan looked up at me with the blank gaze of a stranger who had just been interrupted. "You're back," he said flatly, then bent over to keep folding. I stepped closer, heart pounding. "Where are you going?" He did not look up. "Next state over. I've accepted a new job in New Mexico." My breath stopped. A new job, a new life. No word to me. Then, without a flicker of hesitation, he pulled a slim folder from his bag, placed it on the table, and opened it. Divorce papers. And that was only the beginning of the betrayal I was about to uncover. I stared at the folder on the table, my pulse roaring louder than the traffic outside. The pages were already prepared, neat and sharp, the kind of legal print that sliced into skin without bleeding. I picked it up as if it might burn my hands. Divorce, his signature at the bottom, crisp, practiced, as if he had rehearsed the motion long before tonight. Ethan, What is this? My voice trembled. Not from weakness, but from disbelief. He didn't even stop folding. It's what it looks like. You're no longer the wife I need. I laughed once. A hollow sound that clattered in the air like a dropped tray in the hospital cafeteria. The wife you need. I've been carrying half the rent, half the bills, all while working 12-hour shifts. I come home and cook, clean, keep everything together. And you, my throat caught. You walk out with a suitcase. You're no longer the woman I married, Ethan sneered. I need someone who can elevate me, not drag me down with your small life of scrubs and double shifts. The words struck like stones, absurd and cruel. I tried, I said, my chest tightening. I've worked through exhaustion to give us a life. You come home late and say you already ate. I make dinner, you ignore it. I clean, you tell me not to touch your desk. And now you blame me for not being enough. He looked at me with eyes like glass. Don't bring up petty things. A real wife doesn't need reminders. She just knows. That sentence burrowed under my skin, like a parasite. I wanted to scream, to shake him until his mask cracked, but my voice came out as a bitter laugh. You talk like I've been sitting idle all these years. Do you even know how many nights I've staggered home from a double shift? Still carrying groceries, still checking your shirts for stains, still waiting for you at a cold table. He didn't answer. He slipped his tie into the duffel, tucked in a cologne bottle, and straightened his cuffs. I've already rented an apartment near the new job. I start next week. Don't get in my way. I stepped into the doorway, blocking him. That's it, 10 years together, reduced to paperwork and a suitcase. No apology, no explanation. His eyes narrowed. I don't owe you anything. He shoved past me, the door slamming with the finality of a gavel striking wood. The silence afterward rang louder than his voice ever had. I stood there, clutching the divorce papers, my hands shaking so hard the pages rattled. For hours, I didn't move. The fairy lights outside flickered on automatically, throwing ghostly shadows across the floor. I sat down at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space his suitcase had left, the indent in the carpet where it had stood, a decade erased in an instant. The next morning, I woke with the papers still in my lap, the ink blurred where my fingers had pressed too hard. At work, I tried to lose myself in routine taking vitals, adjusting for drips, smiling at patients who clutched my hand as if I were their last tether. But inside, I was unraveling. Every beeping monitor reminded me of the heartbeat that had flatlined in my own home. 2 days passed with no word. Then, the building management office called. Mrs. Hayes, we received a request to transfer the lease. The current holder is terminating the contract. My breath caught. What? The voice on the line was polite, detached. Mr. Hayes left a note. It says, I no longer live here. The person staying behind will vacate before the end of the month. I hung up, the phone heavy as lead. He had not only left me, but also signed me out of the very roof over my head. I walked into the living room and stared at the sofa, the shelves, the fridge all purchased in my name. Everything remained, yet nothing was mine anymore. The walls seemed to lean closer, pressing down. That night, I opened the desk drawer where Ethan once kept receipts and found the proof every piece of furniture, every appliance, bought under my name. He had left with nothing but clothes, gadgets, and coldness. Strangely, that realization steadied me. If he wanted to erase me, he had failed. His absence was everywhere, but so was my imprint. Still, the divorce papers sat on the table like an untreated wound. For 3 days, I circled them. I stared at the typed lines, hoping an answer would emerge in the spaces between, but all I saw was silence, the same silence he left me with. On the third night, I poured myself a glass of wine, the same bottle I had once planned to open for our anniversary dinner. I sat at the balcony table alone, the fairy lights dimming one by one. I thought of the vows we had made, of the countless dinners left uneaten, of the excuses stacked higher than the hospital's supply shelves, and then my phone buzzed with a notification. A reminder from months ago. Nursing alumni reunion. Friday night, Moonlight Brewery. I had paid the reservation fee back when I believed Ethan and I would show up hand in hand. The perfect couple among old friends. As I stared at the reminder, a random article headline flashed on my phone. Vivian Carter hosts gala in Santa Fe. The name stirred something oddly familiar, though I couldn't place it. I shook it off, not knowing this detail would soon gut me open. Now, the thought of walking in alone felt unbearable, yet the idea of sitting in this apartment, surrounded by his absence, was worse. I picked up the phone, stared at the reminder, and whispered to myself, why not? I didn't know it then, but that single choice to step out, to show up despite the wreckage would lead me toward a truth far darker than abandonment. The apartment felt like a stage after the actors had left, props still in place but the story gone. The sofa sat heavy, its cushions molded to our years together. The bed was still made on his side, the imprint of his head faint on the pillow. Even the smell of his cologne lingered in the hallway, a ghost that refused to leave. But the man himself, my husband of 10 years, was gone. At first I tried to carry on as if nothing had shifted. I cooked dinner for one, leaving the second plate on the counter out of stubborn habit, then scraping it into the trash hours later. I folded laundry and set aside his shirts, only to remember he would never come back for them. I found myself whispering his name when the kettle whistled, as though sound alone might conjure him back. But reality has a way of cornering you. The management office called again, their tone polite but unyielding. "Mrs. Hayes, you'll need to vacate before the end of the month." The words sank into me like ice water. Ethan hadn't just walked out, he had signed me out of my own home. The apartment where I had painted the walls a soft sage green, where I had planted herbs on the balcony, where I had nursed him through 2 bouts of pneumonia. Now it was no longer mine. That night I walked from room to room with the divorce papers clutched in my hand. I touched the back of the dining chair where he used to drape his jacket. I opened the fridge and stared at the beer bottles he'd left behind, labels peeling with condensation. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, tracing the crack in the tile we always said we'd fix, but never did. Everything was still here. Everything but the marriage. The papers remained on the kitchen table like a wound I refused to stitch. 3 days passed, and still I hadn't signed. I circled them like a wary animal, pausing every time I walked by, staring at the sharp letters of my name typed across the top. It felt like a dare, a declaration that I wasn't enough. If I signed, it would mean admitting he was right that I had failed him. Failed us, at work. I wore my nurse's mask of composure. Patients smiled when I fluffed their pillows. Colleagues thanked me for covering shifts. But inside, I was hollow. The hospital corridors blurred, and the beep of monitors sounded like taunts. Every time I washed my hands, the soap smelled like the anniversary cake still waiting in my fridge, untouched. On the 3rd evening, I poured myself a glass of the red wine I had once bought to celebrate our anniversary. I sat alone at the balcony table, fairy lights flickering dimly overhead. I lifted the glass, the bitter temps filling my mouth, and thought of how absurd it was to toast a ghost. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, shadows deep under my eyes. The phone lay silent on the table. No calls, no messages. Just a thin rectangle of glass, holding nothing but rejection. I picked it up, turned it over, pressed it to my forehead, and whispered, "Why?" The phone, like the man, gave me nothing in return. I tried to sleep, but the silence pressed down too heavy. I turned on the radio just to fill the air, and Whitney Houston's voice poured out, "It's not right, but it's okay." The irony made me choke out a laugh that quickly turned to tears. The song was right. It wasn't right, but maybe, somehow, it would be okay. The days blurred. I moved like an automaton: work, cook, clean, sleep. But every corner of the apartment was a reminder of his absence. The empty space on the shoe rack, the second pillow untouched, the toothbrush holder that now looked like a mouth missing teeth. One night, desperate to feel alive, I pulled out our old photo albums. Wedding pictures. Me in a satin gown. Ethan in a sharp black tux, both of us beaming as though life could only go upward. Trips we had taken. Smiles wide as the Colorado sky. But as I flipped through page after page, I realized something chilling. His smile had always been for the camera, never for me. In candid shots, his eyes looked elsewhere, restless, distracted. How had I not seen it before? By the end of the week, the apartment felt unbearable. I packed a small overnight bag and drove aimlessly through the city. Downtown lights shimmered, restaurants buzzed with couples leaning close across tables, laughter spilling into the street. I felt like a ghost drifting through a world that had no place for me. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the harsh fluorescence, and sat gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I could feel the weight of the divorce papers still waiting back at home, patient and cruel. My signature was the only thing missing from the life he had already erased. I didn't know where to go, so I drove back. As I unlocked the door, the silence wrapped around me again. I dropped my keys on the counter, the clatter echoing too loud. My eyes drifted, as they always did, to the table. The papers waited. They were beginning to feel like a living thing, breathing in the dark. I sat down, pen in hand, my fingers trembling. But before I could move, my phone lit up with a notification. My breath caught. It wasn't him, not this time. It was a reminder I had forgotten existed. Nursing alumni reunion. Friday night, Moonlight Brewery. For a moment, I just stared at the glowing words. I had paid the reservation fee months ago. Back when I believed Ethan would stand beside me, the polished husband, the picture-perfect couple. Now the idea of walking in alone twisted my stomach, but the thought of staying here, alone with these papers, was worse. I set down the pen and picked up the phone. My reflection in the black screen stared back, tired but still standing. I whispered, almost to myself, maybe I should go. I didn't know it then, but that single choice to step out into the noise of the world instead of suffocating in silence would lead me to a truth more devastating than abandonment. Friday night arrived like a dare. I stood in front of the mirror, a dozen outfits scattered across the bed like discarded skins. Every dress seemed to belong to someone else, someone happier, someone who still believed in love. Finally, I chose a simple black dress, nothing extravagant, just enough to remind myself that I existed outside of Ethan's shadow. I pulled my hair into a low bun, dabbed on wine-colored lipstick, and stared at the woman in the mirror. She looked tired, yes, but not broken. The Moonlight Brewery was already alive when I arrived. Laughter spilling through its wide doors, golden light pouring across the parking lot. Inside, the air hummed with the chatter of old classmates, the clinking of glasses, the faint notes of music weaving between conversations. I hesitated at the entrance, clutching my purse, my heart thudding like I was 17 again and walking into the high school gym for prom. Only this time, there was no one waiting at the edge of the room to smile at me. I forced my feet forward, scanning faces that had blurred with time. Some looked older, softened by years. Others seemed frozen, as though they had been preserved in nostalgia. A few glanced my way, their eyes widening in recognition, offering polite nods. I returned the gestures, but it felt like swimming against a tide of memories I hadn't asked to relive. Clara, the voice came from behind, warm and familiar in a way that startled me. I turned and nearly didn't recognize him. Marcus Lee Wentz, the lanky pre-med student who carried his guitar everywhere. Now a man with broad shoulders, a hint of stubble, and tired eyes that somehow looked settled. Marcus. My voice carried more surprise than I intended. He smiled, a little shy, holding out a pint of amber beer. Still the last one to show up, huh? I laughed, the sound surprising me with its ease. Some things never change. We found a small table tucked in the back, away from the roar of the crowd. Marcus told me about his life, divorced 3 years ago, raising a 6-year-old daughter. No bitterness, no dramatics, just quiet truths delivered in a steady voice. I listened, sipping my beer, the bitter notes grounding me in the present. For once, someone wasn't asking me about Ethan, wasn't looking at me with pity. When he finally asked, gently, about my marriage, I answered simply, we're getting divorced. No trembling, no collapse, just words. He nodded, not with pity, but with understanding. Then, as if sensing my gratitude, he changed the subject entirely, telling me about his daughter's obsession with dinosaurs. I found myself smiling, truly smiling. For the first time in weeks, time slipped by in the hum of conversation, in the comfort of being seen without judgment. Driving home later through the warm Texas night, windows down, I let the air rush across my face like a cleansing tide. For a moment, I felt almost free, almost new. But freedom has a way of mocking you when you least expect it. As I pulled into the apartment lot, my phone buzzed. A new email. I parked under the dim streetlight, hands trembling as I opened it. The subject line contained just one word. Proof. The message was from Ethan. My chest tightened as I clicked it open. Before I could read the body of the text, an image jumped onto the screen. A marriage certificate. His name, written boldly. Ethan James Hayes. The bride, Vivian Carter, stamped in red ink. The county seal of Santa Fe, New Mexico. The date. One single day after the court finalized our divorce. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, the glow of the phone searing into my eyes, the world around me dissolving into static. My ex-husband had remarried before I could even adjust to being his ex. And not just remarried, he had done so with a woman whose name stirred something long buried in my memory. Before the chill of realization could settle fully, my phone rang. His name flashed across the screen. For a moment I thought of letting it ring, but curiosity clawed harder than pride. I answered. His voice came through disturbingly triumphant, as if he had been waiting for this moment. You saw it, right? I got remarried. Life's never been better. I said nothing. He continued, each word a hammer blow. Her name's Vivian. She's 33, graceful, beautiful, and she's pregnant 3 months along. Her family owns the Carter Hotels, and they built us a house near the Southern Hills. They helped me step into the role of vice president at her company. The words blurred together, pregnant, hotels, vice president. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Then a flicker of recognition struck me like lightning. Vivian Carter. The name wasn't unfamiliar. I had heard it before, years ago, under a different form. I whispered it aloud, my voice shaking. Vivian Carter. And suddenly, the face in my memory rose. Awkward glasses, a timid smile, hair tied back too tight. A girl from high school, invisible, teased for her plainness. She hadn't been Carter then. She had been someone else entirely. I closed my eyes. The past colliding with the present in a blinding flash. This wasn't just a new wife. This was someone I had known before. Someone who had vanished and returned unrecognizable. And with that realization, I understood that Ethan's betrayal was far from over. The marriage certificate sat like a brand burned into my screen. And I couldn't stop reading the names as if they might rearrange themselves into something less cruel. Ethan James Hayes. Vivian Carter. The date stamped with the same indifference as a parking ticket. I felt the familiar air of the car shrink around me. The steering wheel under my palms might as well have been a ledge. One more breath and I would pitch forward into the dark. I forced myself to breathe and opened a browser. My fingers moved on their own, typing with the muscle memory of a decade spent hunting facts in hospital charts. Vivian Carter, Santa Fe. 100 glossy articles, bloomed charity galas, ribbon cuttings, interviews about the modern face of hospitality. Page after page of smooth cheekbones, porcelain skin, elegant gowns, a woman who photographed like a promise. But the name kept scraping at some older corner of my mind, like a nail catching on an old splinter. I refined the search. Vivian Carter maiden name, and then Vivian Carter High School. Nothing. The internet had been curated clean. I opened Facebook, an old instinct I'd almost forgotten I had. I typed Vivian, and then, without thinking, Ellis. For a second, the results flashed and then settled. There were too many Ellis to count. I added the city Austin and the school Crockett High. The list thinned to almost nothing. Then a profile without a picture. V. Ellis. No friends in common. Almost no posts. Just a grainy album labeled senior year with the privacy set to public. By some oversight of time, my heart tripped as I clicked it. The photos loaded like a hesitant confession. A cluster of teenagers at a school dance. Streamers sagging behind them. A marching band on a sunburned field. A girl at the edge of a cafeteria table. Shoulders hunched. Hair a frizzy ponytail. Glasses sliding down a nose that overwhelmed her face. I leaned closer. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking down. Always down. As if waiting for the floor to split and swallow her. In one photo she turned sideways, and there it was, the tooth, the slightly crooked front tooth that gave her a rabbit's softness. Bunny, someone had once whispered behind her back in the hall. I remembered the rumor. The mean laughter that stuck to the lockers. I toggled back to the glossy articles. The corporate head. The woman there had perfect symmetry. No crooked tooth. No soft angles. A jawline sharpened to a blade. Eyes opened like doors to a life that never knew fluorescent cafeteria lights. Not a trace of V. Ellis in Vivian Carter. Not unless you knew where to look. The gaze. The way she never met the lens straight on. The way her smile stopped just short of her eyes. My phone buzzed again. Ethan, calling back. This time I let it ring until the last second, then answered. Because if there was one thing I had learned in hospitals, it was that clarity, however ugly, was better than infection. You looked her up, he said, breathless, delighted, as if we were sharing a joke. She's everything you're not, Clara. She understands what a real marriage looks like: support, presence, family. You sent me a marriage certificate one day after a judge stamped our divorce. I said evenly, you don't want a marriage, you want a promotion? He laughed. That bright, hollow sound he used in meetings when he wanted to signal confidence. You always think small. Vivian's family built the Carter brand across 3 states. They respect ambition. They know how to take care of their own. You never understood that. I understood over time. I understood double shifts. I understood roasting a chicken and watching candles die on our anniversary while you crafted emails like scalpels. Don't be dramatic, he said lightly. Listen, I didn't call to fight. I called because I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm happy now. We're happy. We're expecting a girl. 3 months. The house is almost finished. Southern Hills. There's a view that'll shut you up mid-sentence. The world tilted. He said the words with such buoyant cruelty that for a moment I couldn't tell if I was angry or cold. Behind his voice I heard clinking glass and a swell of laughter, the soft murmur of wealth. I pictured him on a patio that wasn't ours, the air tasting like money. I pictured a woman with a perfect jawline lifting a hand to her belly and glancing away from the phone, already composing the next face for the next photographer. "Congratulations," I said. The word felt like a shard I had to push out of my mouth. "You should have married the View years ago. It sounds more loyal than you." He exhaled, a little amused. "You can be petty if you want. It won't change anything. Sign the papers. Move on. We have." He hung up before I could answer. I sat in the car until the night numbed me, then went upstairs and washed my hands at the kitchen sink like a ritual, scrubbing until the bones beneath my skin felt clean. The apartment hummed in old familiar ways, the fridge cycling on, the neighbor's footsteps above, but everything else felt newly counterfeit, as if the last 10 years had been a stage set dropped on my life overnight. I left the phone on the counter and tried to sleep. I woke before dawn with the memory of a hallway and a girl clutching books to her chest, walking quickly, shoulders up, slipping between bodies like a shadow that feared being stepped on. Heiress, quiet, calculating, some had said, or maybe just learning to count exits in every room. At lunch the next day, I called Lano, one of the only friends from high school I'd kept in orbit through birthdays and occasional texts. "Do you remember a girl named Vivian No Ellis?" I said. "V. Ellis." Lana laughed softly, the sound tinted with old gossip. "Of course. She disappeared after graduation, went to California, came back 2 inches taller, a different nose, different eyes, different chin. She called herself Vivian after that." "Carter?" I said. "As in the hotels." Lana said, the syllable drawn out. "That fits. She dated a married architect in LA for a while, rumor said. Always found a way to orbit power. But she was quiet, not loud about it. Strategic is the polite word." A slow heat rose through me, not shame, not quite anger, recognition. I looked out the hospital window at the parking lot, shimmering in sun. "She's married to Ethan now," I said. "Pregnant, 3 months. He told me himself." Lana whistled. "Of course he did. He always liked angles and mirrors more than people." She paused. "You okay?" The honest answer was that I didn't know. My chest felt both heavy and hollow, like a room after a storm. The roof intact, the shelves bare. "I'm breathing," I said. "That'll do for now. Come over Saturday," she said. "We can burn something in effigy." I smiled, despite myself. Tempting. After my shift, I drove without thinking to a quiet street near the river, parked under pecan trees, and opened the VLS album again. The photos were unkind, the way time is unkind when memory hasn't edited it. Her skin had broken out across her cheeks. Her hair fought any attempt at order. But it wasn't the awkwardness that struck me now. It was the eyes. They were watchful, always measuring, a private abacus clicking behind them. If you erased the hair, the nose, the chin, those eyes would still be there, counting. I switched back to a recent photo of Vivian Carter at a gala. Same gaze, softer edges, more expensive lighting, but the same calculation glossed with charity. She had rebuilt the frame around herself, sanded it smooth, lacquered it with philanthropy and taste. The world had done the rest, mistaking polish for character. I felt no triumph at the discovery, only a slow, sinking clarity. Ethan hadn't married love. He had married a lens. He had chosen a life that would photograph well. It explained so much: his sudden resignation, the apartment in New Mexico, the urgency to cut our lease. He had rehearsed a new story and needed the old one to close before opening night. That night, I took the divorce papers from the table and laid them beneath the lamp. My name stared back at me, the letters suddenly light instead of heavy. I signed once, then again where the notary line waited for a future stamp. When it was done, I sat for a long time looking at the ink, as if it would evaporate and leave the page blank. It didn't. What remained surprised me. Not a void, but a clearing. Days stretched thin and then settled. I packed boxes. I sorted drawers. I found Ethan's high school yearbook at the bottom of his desk, a black spine coated in dust. I hadn't seen it in years. He'd always claimed it was missing. I wiped the cover and opened to his class. The pages smelled like paper and cheap ink. Rows of adolescent faces grinned back at me. And there he was, a boy with acne, soft around the edges, hair too long at the ears, eyes full of a hungry kind of hope. The caption underneath was a nothing phrase, always aiming higher. His front teeth were slightly crooked. I ran my thumb over the picture, not in tenderness, but in recognition. Of course, he had sculpted himself the way you sculpt a resume: shave what doesn't serve, polish what will be seen. He had hidden this book because it told the truth in pixels he couldn't edit. I placed the yearbook beside the papers and stared at the two versions of him then and now's, if one might confess to the other. The room felt very still. When my phone rang, the sound startled me so violently that the yearbook slid and thumped shut. Ethan's name again. For a moment, I thought of letting the call rot in the air. Then, I answered, because the sound of my own restraint had started to bore me. His voice was thinner this time, frayed at the edges. "Clara," he said, breathing too hard. Can you just listen for a second?" My mouth went dry. "No," I said, "but I'll let you talk." "It's about the baby," he said quickly. "She was born last week. She's healthy. Everyone says she's healthy." The storm outside pressed its face against the windows, streaking rain across the glass in silver rivulets. Ethan's voice crackled through the line, uneven, stripped of the arrogance he had flaunted in our last conversation. For the first time in years, he sounded small. "Clara, she's not who she says she is." The words landed like a dull thud, neither surprise nor shock, but confirmation of something I had already suspected. My pulse ticked slowly in my ears. "Who is she then?" Silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of static. "She told me her name was Carter, that her family owns the hotel chain, and yes, her parents built the brand. But Clara," his voice cracked. "Her last name wasn't Carter before. She changed everything. The surgeries, the story. I never saw her old life until now. I found a box she had hidden in the back of her closet. Yearbooks, letters, photos. I didn't recognize her. I didn't recognize the woman I married." I closed my eyes, leaning against the cool wall. In my lap sat Ethan's own high school yearbook, the one I had unearthed from the dust of our apartment. Crooked teeth, acne, hopeful eyes he'd buried under cologne, and polished suits. He had erased himself, and now he'd bound himself to a woman who had done the same. Two ghosts pretending to be whole. "What did you expect?" I asked softly. "You married a mask because you wanted a mask. You built your future on a photograph instead of a person." He inhaled sharply, like the truth had cut him open. "But the baby," his voice faltered. "Clara, she doesn't look like the face Vivian bought. She looks like the girl buried underneath it. And Vivian, she can't stand to look at her own child." The line went quiet except for his uneven breathing. I pictured him pacing a room bigger than ours had ever been. Chandeliers glittering above his hunched shoulders, a house bought with borrowed names. And in that house, a baby with eyes that belonged to the past, a past her mother had tried to carve away. "You called me for what?" I asked finally. "Advice. Forgiveness." "I don't know," he admitted. His voice cracked into a whisper. "I thought you'd understand." A laugh rose bitter in my throat. "Understand what?" "That you left me for a ghost. That you built a castle out of illusions and now complain the foundation is cracking." "No, Ethan, I don't understand. I never will." I hung up before he could answer. The storm outside rattled the windows, the thunder rolling low, like a warning or a drumbeat. I stood in the darkness, staring at the divorce papers, still on the table, my name scrawled across them. The ink hadn't faded. The decision was final. Yet somehow the story was still unfolding, pulling me into a theater I no longer wanted to attend. The next day, I called Lana. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "Tell me again about Vivian Ellis." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because she's not Carter. She's Ellis, and I need to know what she left behind." Lana sighed, then lowered her voice as if someone might overhear through the phone. "She was always quiet, but not the harmless kind of quiet. She watched people, studied them. Sophomore year, she dated a senior, but only because his dad was a local councilman. When that ended, she stopped showing up to dances, stopped speaking much. Then, after graduation, she disappeared to California. When she came back, no one recognized her. New nose, new jawline, new eyes. People whispered she'd done everything possible, chin lips, even cheek implants. She said she studied art, but everyone knew she was orbiting older men with money. And then nothing. She reappeared years later as Vivian Carter. Married into wealth, opened an art gallery in Santa Fe. She's clever, Clara. She knows how to latch onto a ladder and climb." I thanked her and hung up. For a long time I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. My chest was tight, but not with sorrow. With clarity. Ethan hadn't been seduced by love. He had been seduced by the reflection of everything he thought he wanted: wealth, prestige, beauty sharpened into perfection. Vivian had offered him a mirror of his own ambition, and he had stepped through it willingly. That evening, unable to resist, I opened the Carter Hotel's website. A slideshow played on the front page. Vivian in a silver gown at a gala. Vivian shaking hands with state officials. Vivian cutting ribbons with oversized scissors. In every photo, she gleamed like she had been airbrushed into existence. But her eyes. I leaned closer. They were still the eyes of the girl in the cafeteria photo I had found. Watchful, calculating, never soft. I shut the laptop. The echo of thunder still rolling in my mind, though the storm had passed. Days later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a glossy magazine with a full-page spread of Ethan and Vivian, hand in hand, her stomach just beginning to swell beneath a designer gown. The headline screamed, "The New Royal Couple of Santa Fe." I felt something crackle inside me. Not jealousy, not even grief, disgust. They had turned betrayal into a photo shoot. They had made a child into a prop before she was even born. That night, I poured myself another glass of wine and sat by the balcony, the fairy lights still strung along the railing. The city hummed below, oblivious. I flipped through the magazine again, my eyes drawn not to Ethan, not even to Vivian, but to the shadows around their smiles. I thought of the baby they bragged about. I thought of what Ethan had said. "She doesn't look like us." A chill ran down my spine. No mask could hide blood. No surgery could erase genes. The truth had a way of surfacing, carried forward in the eyes of a child. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the night sky, and for the first time, I almost pitied them. They had built a palace on lies, and now their own daughter would hold up a mirror sharper than any scalpel. But pity wasn't enough to keep me from what came next. Because the phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. This time, his words were frantic, desperate. "Please, Clara. You laughed when I told you about her. You knew something. What do you know?" I read the message twice, then 3 times, the corner of my mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. What I knew wasn't just about Vivian, it was about him. About the yearbook he had hidden, the crooked teeth he had buried, the boy he had tried to erase, and I knew the cruelest truth of all. That both of them had spent their lives rewriting themselves, only to discover that the past always signs its name in the next generation. The message glowed on my phone, words frantic and uneven. "You laughed when I told you about her. You knew something. What do you know?" I set the phone down, the corners of my mouth tightening. He was unraveling, threads pulling loose from the suit he had stitched so carefully. For weeks he had strutted in the borrowed feathers of a new life. Now he was calling the woman he had discarded, begging for answers. I should have ignored him, but curiosity has claws. I typed a single line back. "Call me if you need to talk." The phone rang within seconds. His voice trembled, stripped bare of its usual polish. "Clara, the baby was born last week. She's healthy. The doctors say she's fine. But she doesn't look like either of us. Not me, not Vivian." I leaned against the counter, staring at the yearbook still lying open from the night before. Ethan's teenage face smiled up at me. Awkward, flawed, unmistakably human. "Maybe she looks like who you used to be," I said softly. Silence. Then a ragged inhale. "What's that supposed to mean? You've spent your whole life burying yourself under cologne and pressed shirts. You hid every photo that showed who you really were. Did you think your child wouldn't carry the truth in her skin?" His breathing turned harsh, panicked. "Don't say that. You think I'm ashamed of who I was? I just wanted better." "No," I corrected him. "You wanted a mask. And you married a woman who built hers out of scalpels and money. But blood doesn't lie, Ethan. Genetics doesn't lie. Illusions do." On the other end, I heard him pace, the creak of expensive floors under restless feet. "Vivian won't touch her," he whispered. "She cries when she looks at the baby. Her mother has been the one holding her, feeding her. Vivian says she needs rest, but I know the truth. She can't stand the sight of her own child." A cold ache spread through me, heavier than anger. I thought of that baby, tiny fists curling, eyes still new to the world already, rejected by the very woman who had carried her. Not because of illness, not because of cruelty inflicted from outside, but because she carried in her face the truth her parents had tried to carve away. "She's innocent," I said quietly. "Whatever shame you feel, whatever disgust Vivian feels, it isn't hers to carry. Don't put it on her shoulders. She didn't ask to be born into your theater of masks." He let out a broken laugh, jagged as glass. "You always think you're so moral, Clara, but you don't know what it's like. Holding a baby and wondering if the world will see the lies written on her face." My voice hardened. "I know what it's like to hold pain you didn't create. I did it every day in the hospital. And I know what it's like to live in a marriage where love is starved and silence is fed. Don't talk to me about carrying what isn't mine. I survived it. Can you? He went quiet, the line filled only with the sound of his breathing, shallow, frantic. I almost pitied him. Almost. The days that followed brought whispers through Lana, who seemed to have an endless pipeline into the gossip mills of Santa Fe. Vivian had stopped appearing at events. Her art gallery was shuttered, a handwritten sign on the door, closed until further notice. But rumors buzzed that behind closed doors, the Carter family was unraveling. At the hospital, between checking vitals and charting notes, I caught myself thinking of the baby. I pictured her small face, the delicate line of her jaw, maybe the shadow of crooked teeth that would come years later. She had become the embodiment of truth itself, unwanted, undeniable. Late one evening, Ethan called again. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear the sound of his unraveling. She cries every night, he said without greeting. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't slept. Vivian hasn't held her once. Her mother says it'll get better, but I see it in her eyes. She doesn't want this baby. She doesn't want me either. That's not surprising, I replied. You built a marriage on illusions. Illusions can't cradle a child. She's beautiful, Clara, he said suddenly, desperation flooding his words. The baby. She's beautiful in a way I can't explain. But when I look at her, I see pieces of who I used to be. And I hate it. I hate myself for it. I closed my eyes, the ache in my chest spreading. Then stop hating. Start accepting. Because she's yours, Ethan, not the man you built for the world, not the mask you wear at parties. She's yours. The boy with crooked teeth, with acne, with all the flaws you buried, that's who she carries. And no surgery, no job title, no hotel empire can erase that. He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. You always had a way of making me feel small. No, I corrected him again. You've always been small. You just dressed it in big clothes. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Finally, he said, I don't know what to do. You don't need to know right now, I said. You just need to hold your daughter. Start there. I hung up before he could answer, my hand trembling. For the rest of the night, I sat on the balcony, watching the fairy lights flicker. The air was cooler now, autumn settling in. Somewhere out there, a baby cried in a house that looked perfect from the outside, and her cry was the sound of truth breaking through a wall of lies. The next week, Lana called me, her voice bubbling with something between shock and satisfaction. Clara, have you seen the news? No, I said cautiously. Photos leaked. Ethan with a junior manager at Carter Hotels, caught on camera, kissing in a parking garage. Vivian's already met with a divorce attorney. I let the words settle, like stones dropping into a still pond. So it was beginning, the cracks widening, the facade collapsing. But Lana wasn't finished. Her voice dropped. It's worse. Parents at the preschool are gossiping. Someone found out about Vivian's surgeries. Kids have been teasing their daughter, saying, your mom used to be ugly. The poor girl's been crying every day. My chest tightened. Even with all my anger, the image pierced me. A small child, teased for choices that were never hers. Carrying the weight of her parents' vanity on fragile shoulders, I whispered into the phone. She didn't deserve that. No, Lana agreed. But karma doesn't care about innocence. It finds cracks wherever it can. I hung up and sat in the silence of my apartment, the weight of it pressing down. The justice I had wanted was unfolding not through revenge, not through my hands, but through the slow collapse of the illusions they had built. Yet instead of triumph, I felt a complicated heaviness. Triumph tasted bitter when it was bought with a child's tears. I turned off the lights, sat by the window, and let the night press close. Ethan and Vivian were drowning in the very masks they had chosen. And all the while, their daughter, the only innocent one in the story, was left gasping for air. I told myself I was done, that their collapse was theirs alone. But deep inside, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because when illusions burn, they don't just destroy themselves. They light fires in every direction, and soon, their flames would reach beyond their perfect house in Santa Fe. News spreads faster than illness. In the hospital, we used to say gossip moved quicker than infection, carried from room to room by whispers instead of sneezes. Now Ethan's name was on everyone's lips, not as a husband, not as a father, but as a scandal. Lana was the one who called first, her voice alive with disbelief. It's everywhere, Clara. The local news, the blogs, even Twitter. Ethan was caught with one of the junior managers at Carter Hotels, photographed in a parking garage of all places, her hand in his hair, his tie half undone. It's plastered all over the feeds. I sat on my couch, the phone warm against my ear. Outside, The city kept moving, cars groaning down the street. Children shouting on bikes, but inside, the world slowed to a pulse. A strange calm filled me, not joy, not grief, but the heavy recognition of inevitability. Of course, Ethan had reached for another mask. Of course, the man who had abandoned vows for opportunity would abandon opportunity for desire. What about Vivian? I asked. She already met with a divorce attorney. Confidential, but you know how it is, nothing stays quiet long in Santa Fe. Word is, she's furious. Not just about the affair, but about the humiliation. The Carters don't like to be embarrassed in public. It makes them bleed where it shows. The image bloomed in my mind. Vivian, face perfect but trembling, sitting across a mahogany table from a lawyer, her mask cracking along the edges. For years she had cultivated her image like a painting, carefully lit, expertly framed. Now it was peeling in the sun. But it wasn't only the affair. The story that followed cut deeper. Lana's voice lowered. The preschool parents. They found out about Vivian's surgeries. Someone leaked old photos. The kids have been teasing her daughter, saying, "Your mom used to be ugly." The little girl's been crying every day. My throat tightened. I imagined that child, small hands covering her face, tears streaking cheeks that had done nothing wrong. Children can be cruel, yes, but cruelty always comes from somewhere higher, trickling down. Parents whisper, rumors spread, and innocence is stained before it even understands the words. For the first time, I didn't feel anger at Ethan or Vivian. I felt sorrow for a child inheriting shame she hadn't earned, wearing scars of decisions she never made. The papers soon followed. Headlines screamed, Vice President of Carter Hotels in scandalous affair. Photos of Ethan with his mistress splashed across glossy pages. His once perfect smile turned into evidence. Reporters speculated about Vivian's silence, about the Carter family's embarrassment, about shareholders questioning the judgment of a man who couldn't keep his personal life intact. The fallout was brutal. Shareholders demanded Ethan's resignation. Business journals ran headlines about Carter Hotels' collapsing credibility. Vivian's gallery lost sponsorships, and whispers spread that even her own board had pushed her aside. The humiliation wasn't private, it was national news. I clipped one article and laid it on the kitchen table beside the old yearbook. The boy with crooked teeth smiled up from one side. The disgraced executive smirked from the other. Two versions of the same man, both undone by truth. At work, my colleagues whispered in corners. A few dared to ask me, cautiously, "Isn't that your ex?" I answered with the same calm I used in emergencies. "Yes, it is." And then I returned to charting vitals, my pen steady, my hand firm. It was strange. Once Ethan's neglect had hollowed me out. Now his downfall barely rippled the surface. But the ripples spread elsewhere. Carter Hotels announced Ethan's temporary leave of absence. Investors muttered about instability. Vivian was spotted entering the courthouse, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. And still, the baby cried at night. A truth too loud to be silenced by headlines. One evening, Lana sent me a screenshot from a parenting forum. "Does anyone else have a child in Missy's class? The Carter's granddaughter is having a hard time. Please remind your kids to be kind. She's just a little girl." The replies were a mix of pity and venom. Some parents mocked, others defended, but the damage was already done. I put my phone down and pressed my palms against my eyes until colors bloomed in the dark. I thought of the daughter who would grow up learning that beauty was currency, that masks were survival, that truth was a punishment. And I thought of myself, finally breathing outside that world. Finally, free. Justice had come. Yes, but it came like a storm that drowned everyone, guilty and innocent alike. One night, while I sat on the balcony with the fairy lights flickering weakly above me, my phone rang again. Ethan's name glowed against the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice was hoarse, broken. "It's over, Clara. Vivian's leaving me. The Carters are cutting me off. I've lost the job, the house, everything. I don't know where to go." I listened, my chest strangely still. Once, his voice had been my lifeline. Now it was just noise in the dark. "You built a life out of lies," I said softly, "and lies always collect their debt." He sobbed quietly, the sound of a man crumbling. "I thought I'd won. I thought I'd finally made it." "You didn't win, Ethan. You just postponed the truth. And truth is patient. It always arrives." I hung up before he could say more. For a long time I sat in silence, the fairy lights glowing faint above, the air cooling around me. In the distance, a siren wailed, then faded. I realized then that justice wasn't always clean. It wasn't always triumphant or cinematic. Sometimes it was messy, cruel, catching innocence in its net. But it always arrived, and in this case, it had arrived with merciless precision. Ethan had lost everything he had abandoned me to gain. Vivian had been unmasked, her empire cracked, and the world that once celebrated them now pointed and whispered. I thought it might feel like victory, but instead, it felt like release, and in that release, a quiet question began to form. If their empire had collapsed, what was I going to build for myself from the ashes? When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing in the ruins of a life that was no longer mine, and for the first time, it didn't terrify me. The headlines about Ethan and Vivian came and went like storms, sweeping across the desert, loud, messy, and ultimately passing. Their empire had collapsed, but I had no interest in sifting through the rubble. I had my own ground to plant. I moved into a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Austin, a small brick building shaded by pecan trees. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The balcony overlooked a stretch of green hills that caught the sun in the mornings. And I bought clay pots to grow herbs, basil, rosemary, mint plants that didn't demand much, but rewarded patience. Every morning I brewed coffee, opened the sliding door, and let the cool air slip across my face. For once, mornings weren't heavy, they were beginnings. I cut my hours at the hospital, no longer chasing overtime to fill a silence that had never been satisfied. With the extra time, I enrolled in a weekend watercolor class at a local art center. At first, my hands shook with hesitation, unused to creating for myself. But slowly, color began to bleed across paper, shades of blue pooling into shadows, strokes of green curling into leaves. It was messy, imperfect, alive. I realized that healing wasn't about erasing scars. It was about painting new patterns around them. Sometimes, after class, I met with Marcus at a cafe tucked into the corner of a bookstore. He would bring stories about his daughter's newest obsession, space. This week, dinosaurs. The next, and I would listen, smiling, sipping coffee. We didn't make promises. We didn't need to. Our companionship was simple, unburdened. Two people carrying their lives side by side without trying to fuse them into something artificial. One afternoon, as we walked by the river, his daughter ran ahead, pointing at ducks gliding across the water. Marcus watched her with a softness I hadn't seen in years, the kind of tenderness that doesn't need to be performed. He turned to me and said quietly, "You look lighter these days." I laughed, touching the brim of my hat. That's because I finally put down the weight that wasn't mine to carry. At night, I sometimes thought of Ethan, not with longing, not even with anger, but with a detached clarity. He had gambled everything on illusions and lost. Vivian, too, had built a kingdom on masks, only to be unmasked by her own child. The justice of it all was brutal, yes, but it was theirs. No part of me wanted to step back into that fire. Instead, I built rhythms. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, the smell of fresh bread in paper bags. Evenings on the balcony with tea, sketching the horizon in pale washes of color. Calls with Lana that turned from gossip to laughter, stories of resilience rather than ruin. For the first time in years, I understood what peace felt like, not the fragile peace of waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the grounded peace of knowing I could stand on my own 2 feet. One evening, as the sun spilled gold across the hills, I lit the fairy lights I had brought from the old apartment and strung them along my new balcony railing. They flickered to life, warm and steady, not as a stage for someone else, but as a quiet celebration for me. I sat at the table with a glass of wine, looked out at the view, and whispered into the dusk, "I'm still here." And the silence that answered wasn't heavy anymore. It was full. Clara's story is not about revenge, it's about survival. Ethan lost everything. Vivian lost her mask. But Clara lit her balcony lights again, not for anyone else, but for herself. They tried to erase me, but I turned their ashes into my beginning. And yet, while their illusions burned, Clara chose something different. She chose to walk away, not with rage, not with a desire to humiliate, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows the greatest justice is survival. She built a new rhythm, not flashy or perfect, but real. Coffee on her balcony, colors bleeding into watercolor paper, a friendship that carried no weight but still made her smile. In the end, Ethan lost everything he had abandoned her to gain. Vivian was unmasked by the very child who carried her blood. And Clara, she found herself. It's easy to think justice only comes in dramatic scenes, courtrooms, confrontations, revelations, shouted in crowded rooms. But sometimes, justice is silent. It's an empty apartment, becoming a sanctuary. It's a signature on divorce papers turning into freedom. It's the moment you light fairy lights on a balcony. Not for someone else to see, but for yourself. Appearances may fool the world, but time always reveals the truth. And when that truth comes, the ones who built their lives on lies have to face it. Clara didn't need to expose them. They exposed themselves. She didn't need to punish them. Their own choices did. All she had to do was survive long enough to see it happen. Now, I want to ask you, if you were Clara, would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have confronted Ethan and Vivian face to face? What does justice mean to you? Humiliation for those who wronged you, or peace for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if Clara's journey spoke to you, if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever rebuilt yourself from ashes, don't forget to subscribe. Because there are more stories like this, stories that remind us no matter how dark betrayal feels, healing is possible, justice is real, and empowerment is always within reach. Thank you.